A maid who had devoted nearly a decade of her life to caring for the fragile twin sons of a wealthy Boston businessman suddenly found herself accused of a terrible crime. The charge was almost unthinkable, stealing the very medication that kept those boys alive. She had no lawyer, no savings, and no allies. Yet she walked into court with her head held high, surrounded by reporters, cameras, and whispers that followed her like shadows. But just when it seemed that all hope had been stripped away, the heavy courtroom doors opened and everyone turned in shock. The billionaire's fragile twin sons had arrived, and what they said next silenced the entire room. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and tell us where you're watching from. Maya Williams had worked for many years inside the sprawling Davenport estate, a place that always seemed too large and too quiet. The marble floors echoed with footsteps that were not her own, and the scent of polished wood never faded. She had come to the estate when she was 27, answering an ad for a live-in caretaker for Charles Davenport's twin boys, Ethan and Liam. Both children had been diagnosed with spinal muscular atrophy, a cruel condition that slowly stole their strength day by day. Maya's world quickly became theirs. She learned every routine, every sound of the medical machines, every breath pattern of each sleeping child. She fed them, turned them carefully in their beds, and held their hands through long, trembling nights. She read them bedtime stories and laughed at their small jokes, even when her own heart was heavy. Over time, Ethan and Liam had come to love her not as a nurse or maid, but as a mother. Then, one morning, everything changed. Charles Davenport called Maya to his office. His tone over the intercom had been unusually sharp. Maya, wiping her hands on her apron, thought it might concern the boys' upcoming hospital checkup. She smoothed her uniform and walked through the long corridor toward his study. Charles's office was grand, paneled with dark oak and lined with books that no one seemed to read. He sat behind a large mahogany desk, sunlight slanting across his face. His cufflinks caught the light, but his expression was cold. "Maya," he said, his voice calm but cutting. "Sit down." She obeyed, folding her hands nervously in her lap. He didn't waste a second. "There are doses missing," he said flatly. "From the medicine storage." Maya blinked, confused. "Missing? That can't be right. I checked everything last night." Charles interrupted. "Do not lie to me. You are the only person with access to that room." The words hung in the air like smoke. Maya felt her heartbeat pounding against her ribs. "Mr. Davenport, I would never take anything. You know that. I've cared for your sons for years." He leaned back, his jaw tightening. "The facts say otherwise. This medication is worth more than you'll make in a lifetime. It's gone, and you were the only one near it." Maya's throat went dry. "Please, sir. There must be some mistake. Maybe one of the technicians." "There's no mistake," he snapped. Then softer, crueler. "You're just a maid, Maya. A maid who thinks kindness makes her part of this family. But when money disappears, loyalty means nothing. Remember that." She stared at him, her hands trembling. "Sir, I swear on my life." Charles stood up. His tall frame blocked the light from the window. "You'll pay for this," he said quietly, the words slow and deliberate. "Every dollar, every humiliation, you'll feel it." Maya's vision blurred. Her voice cracked when she tried to speak. "You think I could hurt them? You've seen me with them. You've seen how much they mean to me." His face didn't move. "Save your stories for the court. You'll be hearing from my lawyers." She rose to her feet, dizzy. The silence between them felt unbearable. The office suddenly seemed colder, the light harsher. As she turned toward the door, she saw her reflection faintly in the glass cabinet, a woman who had aged 10 years in a single minute. Her steps through the hallway were slow, almost mechanical. The portraits of Charles' ancestors watched her as she passed, their eyes seeming to follow her with judgment. The air felt heavy with betrayal. When she reached the grand staircase, she stopped. The twins' room was upstairs. She could almost hear the faint hum of their machines, the echo of their laughter from just yesterday. Her heart ached to go to them, to hold them, and promise that everything would be fine. But she couldn't. Not now. Not when she was being painted as the monster who might have stolen their only hope. She walked on, past the glass windows that looked out over the manicured gardens, past the polished railing she had wiped down every morning. Her hands felt numb, her legs weak. Outside, the sky was grey. The autumn wind brushed against her cheeks as she stepped through the front doors for what might be the last time. The gate at the end of the long driveway stood open, waiting. She hesitated for a moment and turned back toward the house. From this distance, the estate looked like a fortress, grand, impenetrable and cold. For years it had been her home, her world, her purpose. Now it was just a place that had decided she was guilty before hearing a single word in her defense. Maya walked forward slowly, her shoes crunching against the gravel. When she reached the iron gate, she stopped again, her hands gripping the bars. The thought that Ethan and Liam might believe she had betrayed them hit her harder than anything Charles had said. She whispered to herself, her voice breaking, "I didn't do this." But there was no one there to listen. As the gate closed behind her with a metallic click, Maya Williams left the Davenport estate, not as a caretaker, not as family, but as an accused thief. The wind carried away her tears as she stood at the edge of the long drive, the mansion shrinking in the distance. And for the first time since she had arrived there years ago, she had no idea where she belonged. Maya sat on the worn wooden bench inside Boston's Superior Court, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The courtroom smelled of dry paper and lemon polish. The hum of the lights above seemed unusually loud. Around her, people rustled and whispered. She wore the same plain dress she had worn at the Davenport estate, the one she reached for when she wanted to feel connected to the boys. Her palms were damp, every small sound amplified in her ears. Charles Davenport entered with a quiet, measured stride. He wore a dark suit and was flanked by 2 lawyers and 2 broad-shouldered security officers. Reporters raised pens and cameras, lenses fixed on him. People craned their necks and whispered. Some nodded at his arrival as if his presence were proof. When Judge Harrison came in, the room stood. He took his seat, rapped the bench, and the murmur ebbed into silence. Prosecutor Mr. Sanders rose, his suit crisp, his voice practiced. He opened with a clear account meant to frame what the courtroom would see. He described a quiet house, a locked medicine room, missing doses, and a caretaker who had the keys. He spoke of value, how a single dose could sell for thousands on shadowy markets. The words were heavy currency to those who had never known a life like Maya's. Maya listened as the prosecutor painted her as calculated, someone who had turned affection into opportunity. His narrative left no room for nights she had stayed up to soothe a frightened child, or the mornings she had arrived before sunrise to prepare their feeds. Instead, it fit her into motive, means, and opportunity. The defense table felt empty. A public defender had been assigned, but he had not appeared. Maya's stomach dropped each time she glanced at the vacant chair. She had asked for time, for someone to help her explain the truth, but the judge made it plain that trials could not be delayed. The court's clock ticked like a countdown. Documents were presented, inventory sheets, delivery records, and official statements. Photographs of sealed boxes and empty shelves were displayed on a screen. A technician's signature was magnified on a printed form. It was the kind of detail the room trusted. Witnesses were called. A former housekeeper who suggested Maya had been overly attached to the children. A delivery man who said he had seen someone near the storage. Maya watched each piece wheeled across the courtroom like evidence in a play. The footage shown was clinical and edited. A camera view of a corridor, a figure resembling her approaching the medicine room. There was no sound, no context, just a moment frozen, and the interpretation leaned against her. The prosecution argued this was proof of intent. When the judge paused and asked if Maya wished to speak, her throat was dry. She stood and approached the small podium, the wood worn by nervous hands. For a moment she steadied herself, holding the edge while the room waited. "I have nothing to hide," she began. "I have cared for Ethan and Liam every day. I have kept logs. I would never—" Her words faltered as the judge lifted a hand. "We will focus on facts, not feelings," he said. Her years of love were dismissed as irrelevant. She sat down slowly. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed and words fluttered like birds, hungry for the next soundbite. Inside, the prosecution continued with clinical precision. They presented banking records, transfers to an account bearing Maya's name. Numbers marched across the screen, amounts that would have seemed impossible for someone in her position. Maya's mouth fell open. She had never seen such an account. She moved to speak, but objections rose from the prosecution's table, and the judge reminded her to wait. At one point, Maya asked the clerk if she could show a small folder she had brought, pages of notes, photographs of the boys, printouts of doctor visits. The clerk said she would need permission. The judge said later, when they were ready, they would accept it. Her humanity was filtered through legal formality and stalled. By the short recess, Maya felt reduced to a shadow of herself. Faces once sympathetic now looked away. The prosecution claimed the surgeon's witness had shown 3 doses taken without authorization. The ledger looked damning. Maya left the courtroom to the presses awaiting microphones but refused to speak. A reporter asked, "How could you betray those children?" The question landed like a slap. She stepped into the courtyard and breathed the cold air, as if it could wash away the accusation. Back at Maya's small apartment in Southend, she sat at her kitchen table with the photograph of Ethan and Liam from a birthday years before, both boys in matching shirts, cake on their faces. The living room light hummed. She unfolded a paper napkin and smoothed it with trembling fingers, as if by smoothing she could calm the knot of panic. She told herself she would not give up. She reminded herself that truth had its own weight, but she also felt the cold fact of reality. No money, no connections, no power in the eyes of men who controlled the system. The law was a machine that ran on paperwork and polished arguments, and she had neither. Night fell over the city, and Maya stayed awake, tracing the twins' routines in her mind. The exact time she had given doses, the signatures she had left on logs. Somewhere in the quiet, she found a small ember of resolve. If the court would not hear her now, she promised she would find a way to make it listen. She thought of the precise way Ethan's eyelids fluttered when the medication kicked in, of Liam's stubborn laugh when a cartoon made him giggle. She went over every minute in her head, every scribble in her notebook. If there was a way to prove the record of what she had done, she would find it. She had learned to read machines and charts and had kept a careful log because the boys' lives depended on it. That record, she believed, could still speak for her if anyone would listen. She promised herself she would not let fear decide her future. She would fight. Maya returned to Boston Superior Court the next morning with eyes red from sleeplessness. The marble floors gleamed under harsh fluorescent light, and every sound echoed. The scrape of chairs, the shuffle of shoes, the dry coughs of the spectators. She moved with measured steps toward the defense table, where the empty chair beside her reminded her once again that she was alone. Across the room, Charles Davenport sat flanked by his lawyers, his confidence intact, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He barely acknowledged her. The faint scent of his cologne drifted across the air, sharp and familiar. He looked as though he already knew the verdict. Judge Harrison entered precisely at 9. The courtroom rose, then settled into the same low, uneasy silence that filled every corner of Maya's life these days. She folded her hands together tightly in her lap, whispering a small prayer no one could hear. Mr. Sanders, the prosecutor, began again, measured, persuasive, relentless. He walked across the floor with deliberate pacing, his voice designed to fill the room. "The defendant," he said, turning slightly toward the jury, "used her position to commit theft from 2 helpless children. She had the access, the motive, and the knowledge. The evidence is undeniable. His words came like a hammer, rhythmic and certain. He gestured toward the screen behind him, where images of the medicine boxes appeared. Each of these vials, he continued, is worth over $75,000. A fortune, and this woman saw that fortune within reach. Maya wanted to shout, "That's a lie!" But the tightness in her throat kept her silent. She gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles went white. The world around her blurred into one long, echoing noise. Charles's lead attorney, Margaret Cole, stood next. Her tone was cooler, more precise, the way surgeons cut without leaving visible marks. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, turning to the rows of jurors, "you'll hear talk about devotion and compassion. But affection does not erase accountability. Good intentions don't change facts. Miss Williams used trust as a cover for manipulation. Her words twisted everything Maya had ever done. She made late-night comfort look like strategy, compassion sound like deceit. The audience nodded as though they understood something Maya didn't. When the prosecution rested, Judge Harrison looked toward Maya. "Would you like to make a statement?" he asked. She rose slowly. The courtroom tilted for a moment as she steadied herself. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she spoke. "Your Honor, I have cared for Ethan and Liam Davenport for years. I have bathed them, fed them, prayed over them when they couldn't sleep. I have given them every dose, every hour, just as the doctors prescribed. I've never taken anything that wasn't mine. I love them like my own." She paused, looking at the judge, then at the rows of strangers who would decide her fate. "Please, all I ask is to be believed." Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses. "We are here to review evidence, Miss Williams, not emotion," he said evenly. "You may sit." Her heart sank. She sat down again, folding her hands to stop their trembling. Mr. Sanders stepped forward again, spreading papers across the prosecution's table. "Let's speak about evidence," he said, turning toward the jury. "Video footage from the Davenport estate. Exhibit C." On the screen appeared the now familiar corridor outside the medicine room. There was Maya, grainy and slightly blurred, entering with a keycard. The footage looped twice. "There you see it," Sanders said, tapping the image with his finger. "Our defendant accessing the secure room without authorization. The following morning, doses are missing." He stepped aside, satisfied. Maya shook her head. "I went in to check the temperature logs," she whispered, but no one was listening. The next exhibit showed a series of bank transactions, transfers made to an account under the name Maya L. Williams. The sums were staggering, numbers she'd never seen in her life. "That's not my account," she burst out suddenly, unable to hold back. Her voice cracked through the still air. "I don't even know that bank." The courtroom stirred, people whispering. The judge banged his gavel once. "Miss Williams, control yourself. You will have an opportunity to respond through counsel." She nodded weakly, lowering her eyes. The prosecution continued. Each word, each page, each number was another stone piled on top of her. Her defense was thin air. When the judge announced a recess, Maya felt her body sag against the wooden chair. In the hallway, she stood near a column, watching the reporters gather. They spoke of her as if she were already convicted. "The nanny who stole from sick children," one of them said to another. The phrase traveled across the marble hall like smoke. Back inside, the session resumed. Margaret Cole addressed the court once more. "The evidence, ladies and gentlemen, speaks plainly. We don't need stories. We need truth." Maya barely heard her. Her mind was back in the twins' bedroom. The soft light, the steady hum of machines, the quiet breathing of the boys. "They can't think I did this," she thought. They can't. The hours blurred together until the session adjourned. Outside, the sky was darkening into a slow Boston dusk. Maya walked home along the uneven pavement, her shoulders heavy beneath her coat. Her small apartment waited in silence. She dropped her purse on the counter and sank into the kitchen chair. Tears came without sound. She pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to stop the flood, but it was no use. The image of the courtroom played again and again. The footage, the numbers, the whispers. It all looked real, and that terrified her most of all. On the table lay the small photograph of Ethan and Liam, taken during one of their good days, both smiling faintly at the camera. Maya reached for it, her hands shaking. "They know me," she whispered. "They know I would never hurt them." Her reflection in the window was pale, ghost-like, the city lights behind her flickering faintly. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed and faded. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would go back. She would face the court again. Even if no one believed her, she had to stand up for the truth. Because the only thing worse than being accused was letting the boys grow up believing she had betrayed them. She turned off the kitchen light, leaving the apartment in quiet shadow. The photograph of the twins glowed faintly in the dim moonlight from the window. Maya whispered again, to herself this time, "I will prove it." Maya returned to the courthouse the following morning, her stomach tight with dread. The chill from the marble steps seemed to seep straight through her shoes. The crowd outside was larger this time. Journalists, spectators, people who thrived on scandal. She could hear fragments of their whispers as she passed. "That's her, the maid who stole from the Davenport twins." Every syllable landed like a bruise. Inside the courtroom, the lights felt harsher, the space smaller. She took her seat quietly, placing her folded hands on the table as if to stop them from shaking. Across the aisle, Charles Davenport sat composed as ever. He leaned slightly toward his attorney, Margaret Cole, who whispered something into his ear. He gave a faint nod and allowed himself the smallest of smiles. When Judge Harrison called the court to order, the shuffle of papers echoed through the room. The prosecution wasted no time. Mr. Sanders stood and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we have new evidence that further confirms the defendant's guilt." The large screen flickered on again. What appeared was a new clip of surveillance footage. This one inside the Davenport Estate's West Hall. The camera angle showed the locked storage room door. There, unmistakably, was Maya, her figure moving into frame, her hand reaching for the safe. A wave of murmurs spread through the audience. Maya's mouth went dry. "That's not right," she whispered under her breath. She stared at the footage. The lighting was wrong. The timestamp seemed altered, but to the casual viewer, it looked real, too real. Mr. Sanders continued, "As we can see, this is clear video documentation of the defendant accessing the secured medical storage without authorization." Margaret Cole rose next, her tone even more polished. "Furthermore, the prosecution has obtained banking records showing substantial deposits into an account under Miss Williams's name within 48 hours of this incident. These funds correspond to the estimated street value of the missing medication." Maya's chair scraped against the floor as she stood. "That's not my account. I've never seen that money." The judge raised a hand. "Miss Williams, please remain seated. You will have your opportunity." Her protest died in her throat. She sat, heart pounding so hard it hurt. She looked toward Charles, but his gaze was fixed straight ahead, cold and unmoving. Margaret's voice carried on smoothly, her words slicing through Maya's panic. "Your Honor, this pattern of deception is consistent. This woman exploited her access, falsified records, and took advantage of the trust of two vulnerable children. The evidence, both financial and visual, proves intent, every word chipped away at Maya's resolve. Her breathing came shallow, uneven. "It's not true," she kept repeating silently. "It's not true." When the video played again, she noticed something, barely visible, a flicker in the corner of the frame. It lasted less than a second, but she caught it, a strange distortion, as though the image had been spliced. Her pulse quickened. Someone had tampered with it. She could see it, but how could she make anyone else believe her? She raised her hand. "Your Honor, please," she said, her voice trembling. "That footage has been edited. I never went near those safes. I only managed the medication fridge. That's my duty. The rest..." "Enough," Margaret interrupted sharply. "This courtroom does not need excuses. We have facts." Maya turned toward Judge Harrison, pleading, Your Honor, I'm being framed. I don't know by who, but this isn't real. The judge's face remained still, though his eyes flickered briefly to the screen. We will note your objection, he said. Please be seated. She sank back into her chair, defeated. The rest of the day unfolded like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Witness after witness spoke against her. A former maid claimed Maya had once mentioned the medicine's price. Another employee testified that Maya had grown too attached to the children, as if affection were a sign of deceit. Every word, every whisper turned against her. The reporters scribbled quickly. The jury avoided her eyes. Even the air in the room felt judgmental. By late afternoon, she felt hollow. When the judge called for recess, Maya didn't move. She sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. The grain of the wood blurred as tears pooled in her vision. As the courtroom emptied, she whispered softly, "They've already decided." She didn't know how long she sat there. At some point, the clerk touched her shoulder gently. "Ma'am, the court's adjourned for the day." Maya nodded and rose on unsteady legs. Outside, the Boston air bit into her skin, the kind of cold that found its way into the bones. She walked without purpose, ignoring the stares of strangers, until she reached her apartment. Inside, she slid down the wall of her kitchen until she was sitting on the floor. The tile was cold, but she barely felt it. She pressed her palms to her eyes and let the sobs come, loud and raw. Every word of the trial replayed in her head. The footage, the account, the disbelief. She cried until her chest hurt. And when she could cry no more, she reached for the small framed photo on the counter. The twins in matching sweaters, Ethan's shy smile beside Liam's wide grin. She held it to her chest. "They think I did it," she whispered. "They all think I did." The silence of the apartment swallowed her voice. Hours passed. The city outside dimmed into night, the only light inside coming from the street lamp through her window. Maya finally pulled herself up and sat at the table. She looked at the notes she had scribbled for herself, times, doses, phone calls to the doctors. They were her truth, written in her own careful handwriting. Her reflection in the glass looked older than she remembered. She whispered to it, "You can't give up now. Not yet." She thought of Ethan's hand gripping hers during his last fever, of Liam's laughter as she turned the pages of a book. She thought of how they called her Mommy Maya. She wiped her face and took a deep breath. The fear didn't vanish, but something stronger stirred beneath it. "Resolve," she whispered again. Firmer this time, "I'm not guilty," and she meant it. That night, the city outside Maya's window moved on without her. Lights flickered across the South End skyline, car horns drifted faintly through the cold air, and life went on, indifferent, relentless. Inside her small apartment, time felt frozen. The walls were lined with the echoes of her own breath, the clock ticking too loudly, each second stretching longer than it should. Maya sat at the kitchen table, still in the same clothes she had worn to court. Her coat hung loosely over the back of a chair, and a half-empty cup of coffee had gone cold beside her. She stared at the photo of Ethan and Liam that rested against a stack of papers. Their bright eyes, their innocent smiles, their small, fragile bodies supported by medical braces. She traced her finger gently over the image. She thought about the trial, every word and glance replaying like a cruel film loop. The prosecutor's voice, Margaret Cole's cold precision, Charles's silence. Each had cut something away from her, and yet it wasn't just about herself anymore. The unbearable thought that the twins might grow up believing she had betrayed them, that they would remember her as a thief, twisted inside her like a knife. She stood, restless, and began pacing across the kitchen floor. "No," she murmured. "They have to know the truth. They have to." She went to the narrow shelf near her refrigerator, where she kept a small box of mementos. Cards the twins had drawn, a broken toy soldier, a napkin covered in messy crayon hearts. She opened it and felt her throat tighten. Each item was a piece of a world she'd lost, a home she'd been cast out from. Maya sank to the floor beside the table, pressing the box against her chest. Tears came again, but they were different now, less of despair, more of ache and memory. The air in the room was cold, but inside her something warm flickered, a single stubborn spark that refused to die. Hours passed. The sound of the city faded to nothing. She eventually stood, her knees stiff, and went to her bedroom. The mirror by the door caught her reflection as she passed. She stopped. For a long moment, she just looked. The woman staring back at her looked older than the one who had arrived at the Davenport estate years ago, hair slightly disheveled, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, shoulders curved with the weight of injustice. But behind that exhaustion, she saw something else, endurance. "You're still here," she whispered to her reflection. "You didn't run. You didn't quit." The words steadied her. She thought back to the boy's laughter, to Ethan's whispered thank you on the night his fever broke, to Liam's delighted smile when she made him believe his toy rocket could really fly. She remembered singing to them when the pain got bad, her voice shaking but steady enough to keep them calm. Those moments weren't inventions. They were her truth. She turned back toward the table, where her papers lay scattered, the pages she'd written in neat, careful lines, every dose recorded, every call logged, every instruction from the doctors noted. She ran her finger over the ink. This was proof, even if the court didn't yet see it. She gathered the papers, sorting them by date, stacking them neatly. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from purpose. Somewhere in that stack was the timeline that could show the truth. For the first time since the accusation, she felt something close to clarity. It was after midnight when she sat again, pen in hand, writing notes to herself. Names, times, details, questions. Who else had access to the storage room? What about the other staff? Did anyone audit the deliveries? She wrote until her fingers cramped, until her thoughts finally began to form a pattern she could follow. When she could no longer keep her eyes open, she leaned back in the chair, closing them just for a moment. Memories drifted through her half-sleep. Ethan clutching her finger as a machine beeped in the night. Liam giggling through a story. Charles's voice calling her name with gratitude before suspicion had poisoned everything. She awoke before dawn to the grey light seeping through the window. Her neck ached from sleeping in the chair, but she didn't care. She stood, stretched, and looked out at the quiet street below. The early morning fog rolled past the lamplights like smoke. She went to the sink, splashed cold water on her face, and caught her reflection again in the mirror above it. Her skin was pale, her hair tangled, but her eyes, those were alive again. Maya reached for her uniform hanging on the chair, the same blue-grey dress she had worn every day at the estate. She smoothed it down carefully, brushing away invisible wrinkles. "If I'm going back," she said softly to herself, "I'm going as who I really am." She tied her hair, packed her folder of notes, and slipped the photo of the twins into the front pocket. Then she stood still, taking a deep breath that filled her chest completely. The fear was still there, but it no longer owned her. Beneath it lived something fiercer, love, and the quiet conviction that love deserved to be defended. When she stepped outside, the air was sharp and cold. The first light of morning washed the buildings in pale gold. Maya walked toward the bus stop with steady steps, the city still half asleep around her. She didn't know what would happen when she returned to court. She didn't know if anyone would listen. But she knew this much: she wouldn't let them take her truth away. The bus arrived and she climbed aboard, sitting near the window. Her hands rested on the folder in her lap. As the vehicle moved through the waking city, she watched the fog lift and the sky grow lighter. For the first time in days, she felt like she could breathe. By the time she reached the courthouse, the crowd had already begun to gather. She paused at the bottom of the stone steps, looking up at the tall columns and the carved words above the doors. Boston Justice Hall. They had felt meaningless before. But now, as the cold morning light gleamed on the marble, she whispered, almost like a vow, Let it mean something today. Then she squared her shoulders and began to climb. Maya returned to Boston Superior Court with her folder pressed tight against her chest, the paper edges digging into her palm. The courtroom felt colder than before, less because of the air and more because of the way people looked at her now, as if she were a headline that had walked into human form. The judge took his seat, and the morning light slid across the benches in long, thin bars. Mr. Sanders rose first, his manner calm, the kind of calm that had been rehearsed until it felt like truth. He spoke of new evidence, messages recovered from what the prosecution claimed were encrypted communications between Maya and supposed black market buyers. The words felt absurd even as they landed like stones. The prosecutor described price negotiations, pickup details, and references to the medicine. He called them Exhibit F on the screen. The messages appeared as neat text bubbles, dates, times, and shorthand that made them seem immediate and intimate. "Shipment ready," one line read. "Same dosage as discussed," another. The phrasing was small and ordinary, but when arranged in sequence it began to tell a story of planning, coordination, and profit. The jury leaned forward, heads turned. Margaret Cole, Charles Davenport's lead counsel, watched with an almost imperceptible smile. Maya's breath hitched. She had never typed such words. She had never spoken with anyone about shipping medicine or prices. The whole idea was as foreign to her as flying to another country. She felt as though the room itself had narrowed to the screen and the image of her name beside lines she did not recognize. She tried to speak, but the prosecution was already moving on, explaining metadata, timestamps, and IP traces. "These are not fabrications," Mr. Sanders insisted. "We've traced these to a number registered in Miss Williams's name." He tapped a printed list of phone numbers with clinical certainty. "We will also demonstrate transaction records that correspond with the messages." Margaret Cole rose smoothly, her voice level and precise. "When someone in a position of trust sees such an opportunity," she said, turning to the jury, "they sometimes make decisions that astonish those who misjudged them. We are not suggesting motive based on poverty alone. We are asking you to consider the evidence for what it is," the courtroom murmured. The prosecution's narrative, stitched together with Margaret's stitches, made a pattern that suggested inevitability. Photos of text bubbles flashed again, and the judge nodded as if this were all perfectly ordinary. To the ordinary observer, the coherence of the messages formed a tidy case. To Maya, they were poison. In the center of it all, Charles Davenport sat as though this were an ordinary morning at the club, composed, self-assured, as if the world turned to him out of habit. He adjusted his cufflinks once, an almost casual movement that suggested he expected victory. His poise was the kind that made truth seem like a negotiable commodity. Maya's hands tightened on the folder until the paper creased. She felt trapped inside a story being told about her without her permission. She wanted to shout about broken phones, about how she had lost calls when her device died, how she had never seen those messages. But each protest fell against rules and objections, and the court's rules seemed designed to let narrative outpace explanation. Between the exhibits, a forensic analyst took the stand, speaking to the technicalities, hashes, server logs, and IP addresses. His words were precise and dense, designed to impress and to obfuscate at once. He explained that the messages had been routed through several gateways and ultimately traced back to the number registered under Maya L. Williams. The jury scribbled, as if that trace settled everything. Maya listened, feeling stripped of agency. Her own records, those curled, handwritten logs of doses, times, and calls to doctors, seemed to vanish in the room's hunger for shiny digital proof. The human details she had trusted mattered less than a series of bytes and timestamps that could, in someone's skilled hands, be bent to say anything. At one point, she asked the judge if her small folder could be entered into evidence. Her handwritten logs, notes from medical staff, and appointment confirmations. The judge replied that any materials would need to be verified and possibly subpoenaed through proper channels. "We will consider them at the appropriate time," he said. The phrase felt like a polite eviction. Outside, the press leaned into their microphones and whispered their versions of the story to whoever would listen. Inside, the trial pressed on. The prosecution introduced alleged bank records showing transfers into an account bearing Maya's name at a regional bank. The numbers were large enough to make the jury's eyes widen. The sums looked impossible in the context of everything Maya had been. "I don't know that account," she managed to say, her voice a fragile thread. "I've never—" Objections rose like a wall and were sustained. The judge reminded her to speak through counsel. The absence of her advocate felt like a physical hole at her table, a missing presence that magnified the unfairness of the situation. As the afternoon wore on, Charles's demeanor changed subtly. What had been calm confidence evolved into a softer smugness. He would steal a glance at Margaret, then at the jury, as if testing the audience for approval. He seemed to enjoy the unfolding spectacle. In moments like these, power did not need to raise its voice. It simply reminded everyone around it who controlled the frames of reference. Maya felt each remark as a tiny loss. Each new exhibit stacked a heavier weight on a scale packed unfairly against her. Her hands shook, and the words she needed stayed just out of reach. Still, beneath the panic, a cautious thought took shape. That flicker she had seen in the corner of a surveillance frame before, the slight anomaly, paired with the new, two perfect text images suggested someone had the capacity and intent to create convincing fiction. But how to show it? How to ask a room already leaning toward belief to examine possibility? She clenched her jaw and promised herself she would not let this be the shape of her life. If someone was making evidence, someone had left traces. There were always traces, small, human mistakes, a timestamp out of place, a delivery slip mismatched to the records, a memory from a nurse who had seen too much. When the judge called for a brief recess, the courtroom exhaled. Reporters crowded the hallway. Maya stood and walked slowly to the back, feeling every stare. She hugged her folder to her chest like a talisman. She caught sight of Charles on his way out, his chin lifted, the confidence set to his shoulders. He caught her eye, gave her a look that was almost apologetic, and then turned away. It wasn't pity. It was triumph wearing a face of civility. In that glance, Maya felt the size of the fight that lay ahead. The evidence arrayed against her was clever and polished, and the courts favored what looked like order. But she reminded herself that polished lies could be unpicked. They were still lies. She would need witnesses, records, and the patient. Stubborn work of finding the places where fiction could not perfectly mimic truth. She folded herself into a quiet breath and walked with the others into the courthouse corridor, where the hum of human life felt somehow smaller than before, and yet beneath it, possibility flickered. The courtroom buzzed faintly with the shuffling of papers and murmurs that died down as the doors creaked open. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses, prepared to resume. Maya sat motionless at the defense table, her body tense but her eyes strangely still. She had stopped trembling. The weight of the past days had drained her, but exhaustion had sharpened her focus into something steady and clear. Mr. Sanders was preparing to continue when the heavy doors at the back of the room opened again. At first, no one paid attention. Late arrivals were common. But when the faint sound of wheels scraped across the floor, heads turned. A small gasp rippled through the audience. The courtroom guards stepped aside instinctively. There, framed by the doorway, stood Ethan and Liam Davenport. Ethan clutched a small walker, his thin arms shaking under the effort it took to move each step. Beside him, Liam guided his motorized wheelchair slowly down the aisle, the hum of its wheels cutting through the stunned silence. Their faces were pale, their movements deliberate and painful. Yet both boys carried something that no one else in that room had: purpose. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't known they were coming. For a moment she couldn't move at all. Every instinct screamed to go to them, to protect them from the stairs, but her legs wouldn't obey. The twins' entrance shifted the air entirely. The murmurs stopped. The journalists lowered their cameras. Even Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly, his gavel forgotten in his hand. Charles Davenport, sitting at the prosecution's table, turned at last. For the first time since the trial began, his calm cracked. He stood halfway, unsure what to do, his face frozen between shock and disbelief. The boys didn't speak at first. They didn't have to. Every painful inch they covered toward the front was its own declaration. The courtroom, which had felt like an unbreachable fortress of accusation, now felt human again. Ethan's walker scraped against the floor as he reached the front. Maya rose automatically, tears welling as she knelt to meet him halfway. Liam parked his wheelchair beside them, his small hands trembling slightly as he reached for hers. Miss Maya," Ethan said softly, his voice frail but determined. "We wanted to talk." Maya's lips parted, but no words came. She simply nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. Judge Harrison found his voice again, low and gentle. "You may proceed, boys." Liam looked at the judge, his chin lifted with quiet defiance. "She didn't do anything wrong," he said. "She's our mommy. She takes care of us every single day." The words hung in the room like a bell tolling. Clear, simple, true. A collective exhale swept through the audience. A few people wiped at their eyes. Others looked down, ashamed. Ethan clung to Maya's hand and added, his voice trembling, "We saw people touching the boxes when Daddy wasn't home. We didn't know what to do." Judge Harrison set his pen down slowly, his expression unreadable. "You're certain of this?" he asked. The boy nodded. "Yes, sir, we saw it. Miss Maya didn't steal anything. She's the one who helps us breathe when we can't." Behind the prosecution table, Charles's face tightened. "This is absurd," he said suddenly, his voice rising brittle. "They don't understand what they're saying. They're sick, confused." He took a step forward, his composure breaking. "This isn't evidence. This is manipulation." The judge banged his gavel once, hard. "Enough, Mr. Davenport. Sit down." Charles froze, then slowly obeyed, his jaw clenched. Ethan turned his head slightly toward his father, his small face pale but unwavering. "It's not confusion," he said softly. "You just didn't listen." No one in the room moved. Even the court stenographer had stopped typing for a moment. Maya lowered her forehead gently to Ethan's, her tears falling freely now. "It's okay," she whispered to him, though her voice was breaking. "You did so good." Liam reached for her sleeve and tugged lightly. "We just wanted everyone to know the truth," he said. Judge Harrison leaned forward again. "And when did you see these people, Liam?" "One night," the boy answered. "It was late. We couldn't sleep. Ethan heard something in the hallway, so we looked out. There were 2 people near the storage room door. I couldn't see faces, but one of them was a woman who works with Dad. She had something in her hand." Murmurs rose instantly. Margaret Cole's calm exterior wavered, just slightly, as dozens of eyes turned toward her. Judge Harrison raised a hand to quiet the crowd. "Continue," Liam nodded. "We told Dad the next day, but he said we were dreaming." "We weren't. We saw it." A long silence followed. The judge turned toward the prosecutor's table. "Mr. Sanders," he said quietly, "I'll need all relevant records for that evening." Margaret Cole adjusted her jacket, her expression unreadable now. The confidence that had carried her through days of testimony seemed to drain away. The twins stayed beside Maya, their hands still locked in hers. For the first time in days, she felt something other than fear. She felt seen. The audience no longer looked at her with judgment. Some looked guilty, others emotional, as if realizing how wrong they'd been. The cameras lowered again, no longer for spectacle, but out of something closer to respect. The judge took a deep breath. "We will recess briefly," he said. "When we return, the boys' testimony will be formally recorded." The sound of the gavel echoed once, sharp and final, and the courtroom broke into motion again. Yet no one looked away from the 3 of them. Maya, Ethan, and Liam standing together in quiet unity. For the first time since the trial began, Maya Williams wasn't alone. When the session reconvened, the atmosphere inside Boston Superior Court was entirely different. The room that had once hummed with judgment now held its breath. Ethan and Liam sat near the witness stand, Ethan propped carefully on the chair beside the judge, Liam positioned in his motorized wheelchair, his small hands folded neatly in his lap. Every movement they made seemed deliberate, monumental, and fragile. Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly, his tone unusually soft. "Are you both ready to speak?" he asked. Ethan nodded, his voice no louder than a whisper. "Yes, sir," Liam followed. "We just want to tell the truth." Margaret Cole sat rigid at the prosecution table, her pen tapping silently against her notepad. She wasn't smiling now. Beside her, Charles Davenport looked pale and strangely small against the high wood panels of the courtroom. For days he had commanded the space with confidence, but now the weight of the boy's presence seemed to press against him like gravity. Mr. Sanders, the prosecutor, cleared his throat. "Proceed, Your Honor," Ethan began, his small voice trembling but clear. "Miss Maya takes care of us every day. She never missed our medicine, not once. Even when it made her tired, she stayed up all night to help us." He paused, glancing at Maya, who smiled through silent tears. "She reads to us, and she makes sure the machines work right. When we're scared, she stays beside us. She would never steal our medicine." The judge nodded, taking notes. "Thank you, Ethan. That's very brave of you." Then Liam spoke. His voice was steadier, though his breath came in careful pulls. "One night," he said, "I woke up and heard something outside the room. I thought it was Maya, but it wasn't. I saw someone walk out of the storage room. It was Dad's lawyer, the lady sitting there." The entire courtroom turned toward Margaret Cole. Liam continued, his words slow and deliberate. "She had something in her hand and looked scared. She looked around and then walked away." Judge Harrison's brow furrowed. "You're certain it was her?" Liam nodded. "I remember her shoes. They made the same sound they do right now." Whispers filled the gallery until the judge's gavel struck again. "Order," he said firmly. "Proceed." Maya's heart hammered in her chest. She wanted to speak, to comfort the boys, but she forced herself to stay still. Her entire body shook, not from fear this time, but from disbelief that after everything, the truth was beginning to breathe. When the twins finished, the judge turned to Maya. "Miss Williams, you mentioned having personal records?" Maya stood, her knees trembling. "Yes, Your Honor." She held up her folder. "These are my handwritten notes, logs of every dose I gave, every call I made to St. Vincent Medical Center, every night I stayed with the boys." Judge Harrison gestured for the bailiff to collect the folder. He flipped through the pages carefully, scanning the lines of Maya's neat handwriting. Dates, times, signatures. Hospital confirmations attached with paper clips. Margins filled with tiny notes like "Ethan's fever lowered at 3:15 a.m. or "Liam slept through night, no cough." It was not the language of an opportunist. It was the language of a caregiver. "These align with the hospital's digital check-ins," the judge said after a long moment. "Interesting." Charles shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Margaret Cole's pen stopped tapping. "Your Honor," Maya said softly, "those notes have been with me for years. I kept them because I wanted to remember how far the boys had come. Not for a trial, just for them." Her voice trembled but did not break. Judge Harrison looked at her for a long time, then turned to the prosecution. "Do you wish to respond?" Before Mr. Sanders could rise, Charles stood abruptly, ignoring his lawyer's quiet warning. "Your Honor," he said, his tone cracking, "this is absurd. She's using those children to manipulate the court. My lawyer and I have presented hard evidence, video, bank statements, text records." Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow. "And yet your lawyer has now been directly implicated by a first-hand witness. We'll need to verify these claims." Margaret Cole's composure faltered for the first time. A faint tremor crossed her jaw. The judge continued, Until this testimony is investigated, the court will suspend all further arguments. Charles tried again, louder now. They're confused. They don't understand what they saw. Enough, Mr. Davenport, the judge said sternly. You will sit down. The silence that followed felt heavy but clean, as though the air itself had shifted. The courtroom was no longer tilted in one direction. It was balanced, trembling on the edge of revelation. As the bailiff escorted the boys back to their seats, people in the audience began to whisper, not about guilt, but about possibility. Some exchanged glances, uneasy. Others looked at Maya with a softness that hadn't been there before. The journalists lowered their cameras, watching instead of recording. Maya sat beside the twins as they returned, taking each of their hands in hers. You were so brave, she whispered. Ethan smiled faintly. We told you it would be okay, Mommy Maya. Her tears came freely this time. She bent and kissed their foreheads. For the first time since the nightmare began, she felt warmth return to her chest, a quiet, growing warmth that felt like hope. Judge Harrison spoke again, his voice steadier now. This testimony changes the context of the case. The court will now request an independent review of all evidence presented by the prosecution, including any materials supplied by Ms. Cole. The sound that filled the room wasn't noise. It was realization. The certainty that had once favored Charles Davenport had cracked wide open. As people began to leave for the day's recess, Maya remained seated, still holding Ethan and Liam's hands. The room around them blurred. She could hear reporters whispering words like fabrication, tampering, and motive. But none of it mattered. For the first time in what felt like forever, Maya Williams was no longer invisible. She was heard. She was seen. And somewhere deep in her chest, where fear had lived for weeks, something new had begun to grow: faith. When the session reconvened, the atmosphere inside Boston Superior Court was entirely different. The room that had once hummed with judgment now held its breath. Ethan and Liam sat near the witness stand. Ethan propped carefully on the chair beside the judge, Liam positioned in his motorized wheelchair, his small hands folded neatly in his lap. Every movement they made seemed deliberate, monumental, and fragile. Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly, his tone unusually soft. Are you both ready to speak? He asked. Ethan nodded, his voice no louder than a whisper. Yes, sir. Liam followed. We just want to tell the truth. Margaret Cole sat rigid at the prosecution table, her pen tapping silently against her notepad. She wasn't smiling now. Beside her, Charles Davenport looked pale and strangely small against the high wood panels of the courtroom. For days he had commanded the space with confidence, but now the weight of the boy's presence seemed to press against him like gravity. Mr. Saunders, the prosecutor, cleared his throat. Proceed, Your Honor, Ethan began, his small voice trembling but clear. Miss Maya takes care of us every day. She never missed our medicine, not once. Even when it made her tired, she stayed up all night to help us. He paused, glancing at Maya, who smiled through silent tears. She reads to us, and she makes sure the machines work right. When we're scared, she stays beside us. She would never steal our medicine. The judge nodded, taking notes. Thank you, Ethan. That's very brave of you. Then Liam spoke. His voice was steadier, though his breath came in careful pulls. One night, he said, I woke up and heard something outside the room. I thought it was Maya, but it wasn't. I saw someone walk out of the storage room. It was Dad's lawyer, the lady sitting there. The entire courtroom turned toward Margaret Cole. Liam continued, his words slow and deliberate. She had something in her hand and looked scared. She looked around and then walked away. Judge Harrison's brow furrowed. You're certain it was her? Liam nodded. I remember her shoes. They made the same sound they do right now. Whispers filled the gallery until the judge's gavel struck again. Order, he said firmly. Proceed. Maya's heart hammered in her chest. She wanted to speak, to comfort the boys, but she forced herself to stay still. Her entire body shook, not from fear this time, but from disbelief that after everything, the truth was beginning to breathe. When the twins finished, the judge turned to Maya. "Miss Williams, you mentioned having personal records." Maya stood, her knees trembling. "Yes, Your Honor." She held up her folder. "These are my handwritten notes, logs of every dose I gave, every call I made to St. Vincent Medical Center, every night I stayed with the boys." Judge Harrison gestured for the bailiff to collect the folder. He flipped through the pages carefully, scanning the lines of Maya's neat handwriting, dates, times, signatures, hospital confirmations attached with paperclips, margins filled with tiny notes like Ethan's fever lowered at 3:15 a.m. or Liam slept through night, no cough. It was not the language of an opportunist. It was the language of a caregiver. "These align with the hospital's digital check-ins," the judge said after a long moment. "Interesting." Charles shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Margaret Cole's pen stopped tapping. "Your Honor," Maya said softly, "those notes have been with me for years. I kept them because I wanted to remember how far the boys had come. Not for a trial, just for them." Her voice trembled, but did not break. Judge Harrison looked at her for a long time, then turned to the prosecution. "Do you wish to respond?" Before Mr. Sanders could rise, Charles stood abruptly, ignoring his lawyer's quiet warning. "Your Honor," he said, his tone cracking, "this is absurd. She's using those children to manipulate the court. My lawyer and I have presented hard evidence, video, bank statements, text records." Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow. "And yet your lawyer has now been directly implicated by a first-hand witness. We'll need to verify these claims." Margaret Cole's composure faltered for the first time. A faint tremor crossed her jaw. The judge continued, "Until this testimony is investigated, the court will suspend all further arguments." Charles tried again, louder now. "They're confused. They don't understand what they saw." "Enough, Mr. Davenport," the judge said sternly. "You will sit down." The silence that followed felt heavy but clean, as though the air itself had shifted. The courtroom was no longer tilted in one direction. It was balanced, trembling on the edge of revelation. As the bailiff escorted the boys back to their seats, people in the audience began to whisper, not about guilt, but about possibility. Some exchanged glances, uneasy. Others looked at Maya with a softness that hadn't been there before. The journalists lowered their cameras, watching instead of recording. Maya sat beside the twins as they returned, taking each of their hands in hers. "You were so brave," she whispered. Ethan smiled faintly. "We told you it would be okay, Mommy Maya." Her tears came freely this time. She bent and kissed their foreheads. For the first time since the nightmare began, she felt warmth return to her chest, a quiet, growing warmth that felt like hope. Judge Harrison spoke again, his voice steadier now. "This testimony changes the context of the case. The court will now request an independent review of all evidence presented by the prosecution, including any materials supplied by Ms. Cole." The sound that filled the room wasn't noise. It was realization. The certainty that had once favored Charles Davenport had cracked wide open. As people began to leave for the day's recess, Maya remained seated, still holding Ethan and Liam's hands. The room around them blurred. She could hear reporters whispering words like fabrication, tampering, and motive. But none of it mattered. For the first time in what felt like forever, Maya Williams was no longer invisible. She was heard, she was seen, and somewhere deep in her chest, where fear had lived for weeks, something new had begun to grow. Faith. The final session began in a courtroom transformed. Where there had once been murmurs of doubt, there was now quiet respect. Judge Harrison entered with a folder in hand, his expression clear and resolute. The audience stood, then sat again in expectant silence. Maya rose slowly beside Ethan and Liam, her hands still intertwined with theirs. The judge spoke, his voice firm but measured. After a complete review of all testimony and evidence, this court finds Miss Maya Williams innocent of all charges. The words seemed to echo forever. Maya's breath caught. For a heartbeat, she thought she'd misheard. Then Ethan squeezed her hand, and the realization crashed through her chest like light breaking through storm clouds. Judge Harrison continued. Furthermore, this court orders Mr. Charles Davenport to assume full legal responsibility for all damages caused by the false accusations. A criminal investigation into Ms. Margaret Cole's actions is officially underway. The gavel struck once. The sound was final, clean, and freeing. Maya's knees nearly buckled. She covered her mouth as tears streamed freely down her face. The twins leaned into her, their small hands gripping hers tighter. Around them, the room stirred, not with gossip or accusation this time, but applause. Gentle at first, then growing, reporters lowered their cameras. People stood, some even clapped softly, not for spectacle, but because truth had finally been seen. Charles sat motionless, his shoulders heavy. His once steady composure had crumbled. He stared at Maya from across the room, his lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Finally he stood and said quietly, "Maya, I was wrong." Maya turned toward him, her eyes steady despite the tears. "You didn't just doubt me," she said softly. "You made them believe I was a monster. You made them think I could have let your children die." Charles lowered his gaze. There was no defense left. "I'm sorry," he whispered, but some wounds didn't need answers. She didn't reply. The judge adjourned and the room emptied slowly. Maya remained seated with Ethan and Liam, her arms wrapped around them. They looked up at her with tired but smiling faces. "We told you it would be okay, Mommy Maya," Liam whispered. Outside the courthouse, a crowd waited, not hostile this time, but reverent. As Maya stepped into the sunlight with the twins beside her, cameras flashed. But the images told a new story. The woman who had been accused now walking free, hand in hand with the children who had saved her. For the first time in weeks, Maya breathed deeply. The sky above Boston felt endless. She looked down at the boys and smiled. The world could call her what it wanted: hero, symbol, survivor. But to Ethan and Liam, she was just one thing: Mommy Maya. And that, she knew, was the only truth that ever mattered.